Welcome to Chai with Ping. This is Ping Robert, and in this podcast, we will cover a range of different topics from culture, languages, and underrepresented stories. Join me with a cup of chai and listen to these stories. Hi everyone, welcome back to Chai with Ping. Today we have a very special guest. She is the author of Survivors, Breaking the Silence on Child Sexual Abuse. And I read this book. I didn't finish it because I just felt so hard to read those stories on sexual abuse, especially on children. And so today we're going to talk about this topic, which has been muted or silenced for a long time. So today we have Eirliani, Abdul, Rahman.
Hi. Thanks for having me on your podcast. I'm really honored.
Thank you for coming. Should I call you by Eirliani or Lynn?
Either way, it doesn't matter. Then you can say that I'm also known as Lynn.
Yeah. How did you get that nickname?
My family calls me that. In my culture, we don't go by our formal names.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, Lynn.
It's also superstition, yeah.
Lynn used to be a Singaporean diplomat in Delhi, and that's how we met. And then later, you left your job for some nonprofit organization, right? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it was in India when I met the Nobel Peace Laureate KailashSatyarthi. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014 alongside Malala in Pakistan. So it was really quite an eye-opener from working as a diplomat to working on children's rights. But it's something I'm very passionate about. When I was 17, I saw a documentary on dowry burning, and I vowed to myself that before I turned 40, that I would work to give a voice to the voiceless. And so it was just opportune that I was in India at the right time, right place. And since 2014, I've been working with Nobel Peace Laureate KailashSatyarthi.
I also heard from your previous interview that you left by the time that you almost got promoted as an ambassador for Singapore.
I was one rank below that, so it will we've taken some time to reach that position, and it's not necessarily given that you would. But yes, I was very senior in the foreign service before I left. And in India, as well as in Germany, I ranked third in command at both embassies.
Wow, okay. So there must be a huge cost that you left this job and to do something that you're passionate about. So what did you do after you left the embassy?
So working with Nobel Peace Laureate KailashSatyarthi on the issue of child sexual abuse, he's actually rescued more than 90,000 children from child sex trafficking and child labor over the last 45 years. And I've learned a lot from him. But for me, the issue of child sexual abuse is something I'm very passionate about. It's a cause that's very close to my heart.
And so you already mentioned the topic today, child sexual abuse. Why did you choose this topic? And why
I'm a survivor myself. I'm a survivor myself of child sexual abuse. So this is why I wanted to do it now when I'm still young and have the energy and the context as well to do it. So the Foreign Service, gave me a very good place. The Foreign Service, left me in a very good place because I had the skill set, all the different things that you need to know to learn to lead a nonprofit, like advocacy, media relations, and things like that. And at the same time, there were definitely new skills that I had to learn. And it's been very interesting learning on the job in India. I lived there for 2 years, and I moved to the US 3 years ago. That's where I'm currently based.
Okay. I read your book, and they are heartbreaking, I have to say that. A lot of kids were abused more than one time, like more of a repetitive pattern. And also one of the story also talk about generational sexual abuse. So when you were interviewing those people, how did you decide on narrative approach on your book, and what kind of effect do you hope to bring out to the public?
But actually, this book is one of the first that I know of in the world where survivors have come together to tell the true stories of how they've healed or are healing from the sexual abuse as a child. And we decided that it would help other survivors to do the stories. And the proceeds all go to the nonprofit that I lead. The thing is with child sexual abuse, I think I just decided to just tell the stories as it was. It's very much the narration to me. It was an interview process. And also in some of the stories and chapters, you will see that it's also correspondence. So things that they shared with me, emails, letters, drawings, photographs. So it was very much multimedia to some extent. But it was very interesting because it was also very hard to write because it was very traumatic in certain aspects. Also, it can be very triggering to the reader, triggering for us as well to recount it. But I think it was well worth the effort.
Thank you for sharing. And I'm just interested to know, like, which part of the book inspired you the most?
I think all the survivors themselves were very, very impressive and very strong individuals. So there were five men and 7 women, and they come from all over the world. So Germany, Indonesia, Myanmar, Singapore, India, South Africa, the US, and the UK. I think the ones that affected me more were the stories by the male survivors, simply because you don't hear about them. And the perpetrators were also what you don't hear about normally either, grandmothers and mothers. So in this instance, a few of them were raped by the mothers or grandmothers. And then, like you mentioned earlier, they were also re-victimized over and over again by other perpetrators throughout their lives. So I think in my case, I felt that Sasha's story, the first chapter, he used his real name. Michael's story, he's from Ohio in the US, and Johannes' story in Germany, they really stood out for me. Also the most difficult to write.
Could you tell us a little bit about the story? Like, just give a trailer to the listeners.
So for Johannes, for instance, at the time when he told me his story, he was 62 years old, and he was married to someone from Malta. They found out, during the marriage that they had a daughter who had cancer. And when he told her, his wife, that he was sexually abused as a child, she said that he had sinned. And because of his sins, he had brought this cancer upon the child. The daughter died, and the marriage was dissolved because she didn't want to stay with him. And he was absolutely devastated. And so when we told the story, it was in Hamburg. It was a book reading organized by the Zeit newspaper and also like a German foundation there. You could hear a pin drop in the room. It was so silent, and I didn't expect that kind of response. It was like 70 people, lawyers and practitioners and diplomats, and half the room literally was in tears. So it was like, he was telling the story of how he was raped by his, he was molested by his grandmother, and then he had seen all this trauma that happened to his own mother. She was raped by her father, and then all this thing that happened, and then he was put in orphanage. And then later on in the marriage, she was unhappy, and then the child died, and the wife, got an annulment of the marriage. So it just got worse and worse. It was just simply unbelievable, but really, really just tragic. But when I hear Johannes, and he's come with me on 3 different book readings, he's really grown as a person, and be able to share his story with other people has given him a lot of confidence, a lot of self-affirmation. So that was really good to see the change over the last few years. It's been very transformative, I think, for him.
What are the common myths that you have come across from the people that, like, during the book reading or at your work, that people will hold against those sexual survivors?
I think this is a really good question, because one of the things is the taboo surrounding child sexual abuse. People think that somehow the children is involved. What they see now is an adult. And so I always tell people, you are not a Lolita, you're not a 12-year-old who can seduce a much older grown man or grown woman. You have to dispel that from your head. And people see them with that colored lens. And it's very wrong, because a child, no matter how old, cannot give consent. So even if he or she seems to enjoy it, it's still wrong because there's no consent involved. Another thing I also come across a lot is that male survivors ask themselves when they have been abused by males whether they are homosexual. It has nothing to do with anything, because again, no consent was given. It does not mean that they've been abused by a male that they will turn out to be homosexual. There's much more at play. So these are very simple myths, and we need to break them.
Wow. What are the most shocking reaction? Like you just mentioned one in Germany already, but like, what are the general response or reaction from the public when you went to the book readings?
I think he's been very supportive in general. It has always been 100% supportive. The one in Hamburg was the most emotional, I think, but it has never been nothing but short of supportive. So I think that's been very encouraging for all the survivors who sit there and tell their stories. Also, the survivors themselves are very different, as you can imagine. So the one in Hamburg, there was another young lady who was in her 20s, and she told her story, but she read almost like a monologue. It was really shocking because she was describing graphic things like fellatio in the monologue. And then Johannes then spoke next, and he was emotional and in tears. So even that juxtaposition is also helpful to people to see, because you have different ways of coping. And survivors, like myself included, are just amazing at dissociation, which may not help you in normal life too, because sometimes you need to emote, you need to be able to respond and be vulnerable and be intimate. So yeah, it's just been it's been very positive so far, a wonderful experience.
As before the interview, we talked briefly about how much you cannot talk about your own experience. So I just want to kind of probe a little bit. What is your experience, and how did you overcome the difficulties in your own life?
I think for me, I thought that I was abused between the ages of 10 to 14, but then I realized through a flashback a couple of years ago that I was probably younger, maybe 8 when it happened. And so it was disappointing because I didn't think I was that young, and I really felt my entire childhood was gone. In my 20s, I was a very angry person, very different to how I am now, much more calm. She's not saying a lot, but yeah, it's just been difficult. I think what helped me was, even though I went through a lot of therapy and tried to seek help, I think what really helped me was rock climbing, because it was a sport where if you're not committed in your mind, you will actually fall off the ledge. It's called commitment, literally in rock climbing terms. And so if you think that you cannot reach that ledge, or you cannot reach for that hold, your body would just scrunch up, and you're like tight, and you will fall off. And also, if you are just not there mentally, you're somewhere else, you will also fall off. And so it really made me be united in my mind and body and stop my dissociation. And I think that's how I healed a lot through that process of rock climbing and learning. The other thing was really also working on the book. I think it really helps connecting with other survivors. And a lot of them told me too, they wouldn't have told their stories and not for another survivor like me, because it's really hard to open up to understand what someone else has gone through.
You mentioned about therapy. I want to touch a little bit on that. Is therapy helpful in your case of studies, and when you're talking to people? How's their response?
I think each person is different. I never advocate for any one particular way. So there's different ways of, like, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy, where you're trying to change your behavior in response to some external stimuli. But to each their own. For me, for example, it was sports. It was rock climbing. Some people would prefer to dance or do art therapy or music therapy. So whatever would feel best for you. Also because you may be triggered by different things. So sometimes music may not be the best way to get healed if you had music playing in the background when you were being raped, for instance. So it really depends on each person's specific conditions.
And I also know this kind of lifelong trauma will take a long, long time to recover. So then, did you go on a book tour, and then there are some people from the audience kind of confessed that they were abused?
Yeah, it happens a lot. And because you would tend to, as a survivor, you tend to put away what happened, just dissociate and put it compartmentalize. And then some people would feel like, oh my gosh, I think something might have happened to me as a child. Let me just go out to these book readings and find out. And I would talk about the kind of things that you can look for, and then the kind of behavior to expect of someone who has been abused. It doesn't have to be, we are on 2 spectrums. So we're not in a norm. There's no normal middle. So we're either on this side, which is overachieving, perfectionist, very good in school, at work, but a bit of a control freak because you had nothing under control as a child, not even your own safety. And on the other aspect, you're into all kinds of addiction. So it could be drugs, alcohol, substance abuse. But you're not in the middle. You're on either side. And so I would talk about this extremes in terms of the spectrum, and people would then see them in themselves, some parts of that, and so it could be as simple as, for example, in my case, when I was living in India, I had a household help, and she would come every Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and then she would move things around as she cleaned. And when I came back home, I would move them back to where they were. So it's just being a control freak. But that's one symptom of you wanting to exercise control over your lives. You could be controlling of other people too. You may not want to, you may hate changes. For instance, someone canceling on you last minute, you feel abandoned. So many, many different things that you can look up for other than the obvious ones like addiction. Because addiction is not actually looking at, even unless you're looking at the root causes of it, it's very hard to then get rid of your addiction.
So there are a lot of people who are obese in the US, and then it's kind of like a documentary how they got help. But it was to my surprise that a lot of them were sexually abused. So they kind of kept eating, and then they become sick and obese. So yeah, thank you for sharing that with us. As outsiders, or for example, I'm a teacher, I could be around students a lot, around different people. If we want to find out if there's anything wrong with students or with our friends and all that, what are the tips and hints that we should look for when someone is being abused sexually?
That's a really good question, because a lot of people say, how do I help? What can I do? And it's just looking out for somebody in your life who could be, if you don't have a child, a nephew or a niece, or like you say, if you're an educator, someone in your classroom. So sometimes what you need to look out for is depending on the age groups. So if it's someone younger, they have regressive behavior. So let's say it's a 10-year-old, but then he or she is not sucking her thumb like a younger child, or is bedwetting at home, and the parent just complained to you casually about it. And then you need to find out a bit more. In younger children also, they may display knowledge of, like mature language, which is not appropriate for their age. So how did they get to know that kind of language? Also in children as well, if they display excessive fear of a personal place, you should take note. What I also do is when I tell people to be careful cultural mores, cultural nuances, because sometimes, for instance, in some cultures like mine, you insist that you kiss the hand of an elder person, and then it may not be, the child may not feel safe because it could be the rapist. As was in my case, I wasn't raped, but I was molested. And so if you give your child agency and say it's up to you who you want to touch with your hand or hugging or any form, then you give the child agency. And if he or she says no, it already is a red flag to you that you should be careful of this person and find out more.
Would there be a reverse psychology, for example, after the child was abused and then they become very close to that person?
It depends on how close, what kind of relationship it is. So if it's familial, what I tell people that I work with is that you shouldn't throw away everything, the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. You still have to remember the good times, the loving times, because it's also a part of their critical relationship. But that's really difficult. So yes, in some cases, the child will still be very close to the perpetrator, and it's very confusing for a child. And never mind the physical response, because that's also very confusing, but also the emotional response.
Wow, thank you. Whew, I have to, I feel very heavy in my heart right now. But then I want to shift a little bit to your work that you mentioned last year, or maybe last 2 years. You mentioned that you have some work, and so you're training for going to the North Pole or South Pole.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that and why are you doing that?
I handled media relations when I was in the embassy in India. And, when you tell the media a cookie story, like why is a diplomat from a tropical island skiing to the North Pole, and you catch people's attention. So you then can say, you can talk about the cause. And my cause is very clear, is to raise awareness of child sexual abuse. And I've raised a lot of media attention back in Singapore. So I was interviewed by the Channel News Asia, by the major broadsheets. In the UK, when I spoke at the Parliament, I was actually interviewed by the Sunday Times, which is the UK's largest broadsheet over there. So it was really about raising that kind of awareness. And obviously this year I couldn't ski there because of COVID-19. And last year there was global warming, well, in general, that's ongoing. But last year was pretty bad. And so the entire season got canceled for the first time in its history. And so they were asking us, we could bring you there, but we're not sure we can bring you back. And so we were like, oh, the entire season got canceled. So I'm hoping next year in April that we can go still. And we will be flying to Norway, Svalbard, and from there it's our jumping off point to go to the North Pole.
That is so exciting. Well, help me to understand a little bit, because I'm not sure about, like, if I understood you right. You're saying that if you go skiing in the North Pole, and then you will have a lot of like publicity. So then how do you use that publicity to help your work on child sexual abuse?
So if you Google me, you see that there's a lot of news articles and reports already about the work that I do, including the North Pole expedition and training. So that's how I do it, because the media likes a cookie story, and especially if you're authentic about it. So it's not just like the idea of just doing something for the sake of doing something. At the same time, I'm also very cautious. So I already had done survival training and under real Arctic conditions, and trained with this mother-daughter duo called Sarah McNair-Landry and Matty McNair. And so they're pretty well known in the Arctic exploration circle. It's a very small group, but they're also like well known by the National Geographic. Sarah is a Red Bull ambassador. So I'm trained to take on the stuff. So it's like minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is minus 50 C. And, after a certain point, they're about the same. And survival skills, you're doing a half marathon every day for 8 to 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day. When you finish, you still have to smoothen down the ice, take snow and then melt it and make your own water, cook for your own dinner after a whole day of skiing. And you're pulling about 185 pounds behind you, which is your food, your tent, your gear. So it's very different I always say it's very different to mountaineering, where you have shippers, people all along you, helping you. Here you're on your own, so you need to really know what you're doing.
Fascinating. I respect you, Lynn. I don't know how you fit everything in your schedule. You seem to be flying all the time, and then doing so many things at your work, and book writing and book reading and skiing, training, and North Pole. And wow. So how has your work influenced you?
How has my what?
How has your work influenced you? Like, does it bring hope, light, despair, or like more of the urge that you need to do something more?
I think some days is very despairing, but you need to learn to do self-care. And I think we as women especially need to be more careful, because we are like caregivers, very nurturing, and we tend to do a lot for others. So for me, it could be as simple as having a cup of green tea, taking some pause for myself, exercising when I don't feel like it, doing things for myself that I need to. And then, so that I can then take care of others. It's the whole adage, where you sit on an airplane and you put your mask on first before you can put the mask on someone else. So, that's why I do. And some days are great. Some days you meet a survivor who she or he was at your book reading, or is a loved one, who asked a question, and then later on came to you private and asked more questions to help, his wife who's going through this. And then couples have gone through counseling because of what they've done with me, and it's been really it's great. It's hard work, but it can be really joyful work too when you see the fruit of it at the end.
And then you also mentioned that you're looking for a different job. So what are your plans for this year and next year?
I like to do the things that I couldn't do before. So right now, since with COVID and everything, it kind of prepared me to be be steely in all this during this uncertain time. So I'm looking at consultancies where I can continue writing and work from anywhere. Looking at the issue of online child protection, especially, that's my forte. I especially enjoyed working on that kind of issue. I sit on Twitter's Trust and Safety Council, and we advise the CEO on online child safety issues before they roll out new products. So things like that, especially because I think cybercrimes and child sexual abuse material is a very new area, and a lot of governments are not looking at it closely. It can include like cyberbullying, cyber suicides, trolling, sexting. It's something that we need to do look at more closely, because I think kids are on it all the time on the devices, and parents and guardians are not spending as much time or are as aware of the issues as they should be.
And all the work that you just mentioned is also within your organization, because you have one organization.
I have different hats.
Right?
Yeah, so I have my own nonprofit called Yakin, which stands for Youth, Adult Survivors, and Kin in Need. And I set up with Professor Daniel Fung in Singapore. But I also have that hat working for the Nobel Peace Laureate, and there's some overlap. But child sexual abuse has always been my passion, and I write and work on it constantly.
We will definitely put all the information that Lynn just mentioned in the episode notes, so anyone who's interested can find the links and also get in touch with you. Before we end, are there any last thoughts or lingering ideas that you want to share with us?
I think, a lot of people always say when they look at me as a survivor, oh, poor you, that was really bad what you went through. But I really feel that the scars that I've been through now, looking back, and, it's given me the courage to work with other survivors who otherwise wouldn't have stepped forward or opened up. And because we are doing that, more and more survivors are also coming forward to talk about their stories and start their healing processes. So it was hard maybe in the beginning, but I think it was worth it, because I'm able now to help others. So I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, but it's one way to make a positive change in this world.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for coming to share all the ideas that you just brought. And I once again want to mention that her book is called The Survivors, Breaking the Silence on Child Sexual Abuse. And thank you, Lynn, for coming to the show.
Thanks so much, Ping, for having me on board. It's been a real honor. Thank you again.
Thanks for listening to Chai with Ping. Let us hear your voices and stories. Please share this episode, like and follow us on Instagram at chaiwithping. You can also email us at chaiwithping@gmail.com. Till next time.